Old school, new school, what are you? Let's pour some coffee on it. Hey, I'm Father Brad Doyle, and you're watching Coffee Talk, where we drink coffee and talk about Jesus. St. Augustine has a famous quotation. It's one of my favorite. It's from his book, The Confessions. It's not him confessing his sins. It's him confessing his faith journey. It's basically his spiritual journal. And in it, he says this towards the beginning. He's talking to God. He said, "Late have I loved you." It took him a while, right? "Late have I loved you, O beauty ever ancient, ever new. Late have I loved you." God is both ancient and new all at the same time. It's a paradox. And really, only paradoxes can adequately, in as much as we can, adequately describe God. Ancient and new. And so if we as a church are going to emulate God, if we're going to emulate Christ, if we're going to be Christians and look like God, look like the Trinity, then we're going to have to look both ancient and new at the same time. The church is always renewing and developing her practices and her doctrine. You know, we shouldn't be afraid of the development of doctrine. The church fathers often speak of it as a sapling and an oak tree, essentially the same organism at different stages of development, and may look even drastically different in some ways, but essentially the same thing. So the church, the faith, the apostolic faith, while it was in a sapling form early on, and may even look slightly different later on, it's still the same thing. It's called the development of doctrine. We shouldn't be afraid of it. That's why we have church councils like Nicaea and Ephesus and Constantinople and the Fourth Lateran Council and Vatican I in the late 1800s and the Second Vatican Council, which is a major one in a lot of our lifetimes and our grandparents' lifetimes. And so there was a lot of changes, a lot of development, and we shouldn't be afraid of it. One of those is the language of the Mass. That it opened up the vernacular again to say the Mass in the vernacular. For us, if you're listening to this, in the English language. But remember what I said at the beginning. God is ever ancient and ever new. The church is ancient and new. And so even though we embrace change and we embrace development, we shouldn't be afraid of the ancientness of our faith. We shouldn't be afraid of timeless practices and timeless traditions and timeless expressions of our faith. And so this episode, we're going to look at a couple of practices that are older, more traditional, and maybe explain them, explain the fruits of them, maybe explain the benefits of them if people still want to practice them. Number one, receiving communion at an altar rail. Now, you might go into an old church, maybe in New Orleans or wherever you are, if you have old churches, wherever you're watching, and you might see a railing at the front of the sanctuary. And newer churches usually don't have that, but you might ask yourself, what is this for? Well, at some point in the church, and at a large history of the church, you would receive the Eucharist kneeling down, and you receive it at the altar rail. I want to be clear, you don't have to receive the Eucharist kneeling at this time in history, and you don't have to receive at the altar rail. In the Mass and in our churches, we're constantly trying to balance the idea of our intimacy with Christ, our ability to enter into the mystery because he tore the veil, and also our distance, the mystery that Christ is. There still is a veil that veils us, that we will be through whenever we die. And so we're finding that balance. What altar rails can do is highlight that separation, highlight that we're not yet in heaven. Though we're experiencing heavenly things in the Mass, we're not yet there, and it provides a beneficial separation, a beneficial mystery, a way of understanding that we are called to go deeper into a mystery, to not take it for granted, to not take it flippantly, that the Eucharist is the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Jesus. There's also ancient connections to the Holy of Holies. So our churches are set up, right? There's like an Ark of the Covenant. That's the tabernacle. Sometimes there's angels on our tabernacles that are watching over, like in the Old Testament, the Ark of the Covenant. And there was separations in the temple. The Holy of Holies was a deeper part, and that's where the sanctuary would be. So that's where the altar rail would signify. Also in Eastern churches, maybe Eastern Catholic churches, they have even more intense separations between the sanctuary and the Eucharistic prayer and the people, the bride. These even more intense. They're called iconostases. They're walls of icons. So the saints, the cloud of witnesses in Hebrews that we see is in between us and the mystery, calling the people. Hey, come be like us. Come be like the saints, and we will usher you into the mystery. We shouldn't be afraid of these traditions, even though the church is wide and we don't have to practice that. Number 2, chapel veils. You ever see a woman or a girl wearing a veil over her hair when she's in the presence of the Blessed Sacrament or in Mass? It's a good thing if approached appropriately. Here's the theology behind it. Some people think that chapel veils are oppressive, that it's meant to push women down. That's a false understanding of chapel veils. Instead, it's meant to recognize the feminine genius. What do women represent for us? More intensely than men. They represent the church, active receptivity, just like Our Lady, who is often depicted as veiled. They are the bride of Christ, played out before us, represented before us. Why do brides still, most of the time, wear veils, at least in our culture and our tradition here? Because they represent, even if for a day very clearly in their white dress, and their royal status almost in weddings, they represent Israel, the New Jerusalem, the bride of Christ, coming down the aisle, and you veil those things that are sacred. You veil chalices, you veil the Ark of the Covenant, and you veil the crown of creation, woman, femininity, that mystery of active receptivity. Third, old school practice that we need to understand and clear up some things, ad orientem. Ad orientem is a Latin phrase. It means towards the east, right? Ad means face towards, and orientem, like you think of oriental or the Orient, it's the east. So it's the practice when saying the Mass facing east. So you might remember, or you might recall from pictures or history, the priest at some point in the Mass, in the old extraordinary form of the Mass before the Second Vatican Council, facing away from the people. And that brought with it a lot of baggage, and people would describe it as the priest facing away from us or turning his back on us. It all depends on perspective, right? Instead, I think it's better to see this as not the priest turning his back on the people, but the priest turning with the people toward God, toward the tabernacle, toward the altar, which is a representation of Christ, toward heaven. Gathering the people's prayers at the offertory, and then turning towards the person and the persons in the Trinity of which the Eucharistic prayer is directed. When I say the Eucharistic prayer, I'm not talking to you. I'm talking with you, to God. All the ancient Christians faced east when praying. Every major religion has a direction of prayer, really, and Christians is east. And even if our churches aren't directed that way, liturgical east. Let's face together towards the rising sun, because the sun rises in the east, awaiting Christ, awaiting his second coming, symbolically. I have a little analogy for you too. If you're driving down the road and a bus driver is driving you, you want to see your bus driver's face? If your bus driver is looking at you, you know what you're probably thinking? We're going to die. You're going to die. You're going to crash. You want your bus driver going that way. And I'm like the bus driver. Get on, all aboard, going aboard. We're going to heaven. Get on the bus. Here's our prayers. Let's go. That's ad orientem. Let's wrap it up. We should be comfortable with development, comfortable with change, because we're rooted solidly in the apostolic tradition. We shouldn't fear development. We shouldn't fear the relevancy and the fast-pacedness of the world, because we can develop, we can go with the world and answer the questions of the world quickly, because Christ gives us those answers. But we also shouldn't fear ancientness. We shouldn't fear things that are old, because like I said at the beginning, God is ever ancient and ever new, and so is his church.